OPTMZ.
Matt Hannigan is a strategist, researcher, and curator working at the intersections of design, sport, fashion, art, and music. For close to a decade, he directed energy collaborations and creative projects at Nike in London and across Europe, developing initiatives with designers and artists including Martine Rose, Samuel Ross, Tom Sachs, Virgil Abloh, and Anne Imhoff. In 2024, he founded Inner City Resource, a platform for cross-disciplinary work that brings leading voices in fashion, music, and contemporary art into dialogue with global brands, institutions, and creative organizations. His work is invested in the circulation of subcultures, exploring how creative forms, communities, and infrastructures migrate, transform, and shape broader cultural economies.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Daniel, for the invite. Essentially, he was kindly asked me to come and speak about my experiences in fashion, sport, and wellness. So here we are, and it's a pleasure to meet you all. Just a little bit of guidance for today. I don't usually love a presentation, I much prefer a discussion. So there will be time for Q&A at the end, but if you have a burning question, please interrupt me. We're going to be here together for a bit, so let's make it as flow as possible. So a little bit about me beyond that introduction, which was significant. I suppose my life has had like 3 big phases in it, which we'll take you through briefly. But I suppose subculture has always remained omnipresent. For me, was the gateway to everything, the through line for everything. So, you know, in my working practice and my journey with brands, corporations, and founding a studio, everything came from cutting my teeth in the subcultural zone. And in reality, everything started in the rave. So as a kid, I was pretty obsessed with kind of Detroit's view on techno-futurism. I don't know if you've ever read Alvin Toffler's The Third Wave. I recommend you read it. That text was quite influential in the formation of techno. As a music and as a community, it was always very kind of future-facing. It was very kind of utopian in its view and from the city that was born. And from there, I kind of run techno parties in London, and that introduced me really to a definition of community, but the identity that came with it. And I really felt what it was like to live in a city where kind of counterculture existed and lived and breathed. I've always been from East London, but that period of time was in the lead up to the Olympics, as you know, it was hugely transformative. I don't think this building would be here without that as a moment. So it's pretty interesting sitting here and talking about it. A few things happened after that, but essentially the dance floor per se led me to make connections in the fashion, sport and wellness zones. And it culminated in me working at Nike for 10 years. I worked and I headed up an energy team in London, which its main role was to kind of cultivate future collaborators, build innovative product, conjure up visionary marketing plans, and always mixing between cultural fields. And after 10 years, actually last year, I set up Inner City Resource, which kind of takes a lot of the ethic from that time, from the 2 phases before. It's a cross-disciplinary studio. We work a lot on strategy, research, consultancy for many brands, but also work on special projects with institutions and different commissions in various spaces. So that's kind of like a little bit of a brief context. And the reason why I say it is I really want to kind of give you a window into some real lived experience, but we'll come and talk about that later. So whenever I do these types of talks, we always talk about the state of play. It's critical in order to understand why we exist and the world around us. I think it's kind of an obvious point, but one that you experience every day, that in a world overloaded with products, content, information, not all of it true, I think we're all searching for truth. And I think visionary audiences around the world, now more than ever, in this kind of broken planet we find ourselves in, this search for truth is really at the core of everything. And if we look at what is truthful, I think when we are in this kind of AI-fueled world, you'll know this more than ever, is like lived experience and human interactions are a beacon of trust. And whether it is with projects with the studio or kind of teams at Nike or kind of any project I'd worked on, I suppose I always lean to teammates or people in projects that have that lived experience. It doesn't really matter in what exact space, but connected to the project, they need to have really lived something, lived and breathed it and watched it and felt it. And when you really find that, then that idea of trust and truth can be built around that idea of just living it, really getting out there and being in it. And I think the difference is that, you know, when you're a protagonist or a participant in a cultural field or a community or an entity, you really know what it's like to drive something and be part of something. And even if you're still on the edges, but you're a supporter, you know what it's like to have the identity connected to something. And I think that's like really critical. And I think when you're kind of doing wherever you go from here, it's really positioning yourself in that zone where you can talk from first experience is really, really critical. Because on the other side, you know, you can be a real scholar of something, but that scholarism can connect to kind of a more voyeuristic or fetishist approach on subject matter. So I think it's like everyone needs to find their own balance, but really theory is really important. It explains kind of the reasons behind things and gives you like the view of how to kind of construct arguments and make decisions, but really it's about the experience, and the experience metabolizes any type of theory. So the one-liner really is that the real truth is earned through doing. So getting out there and doing it is incredibly important. So why do I kind of start with that? Because today I want to focus the conversation on that lived experience. So real projects, experiences and entities, and I'll kind of take you through some case studies about the interaction between these three segments and these three kind of phenomenons. So, as you can see, collaboration is central to my practice, obviously from various positions before, but I just love people. I love working with people. I love working with entities and figuring out how to find bridges and authentic kind of systems that connect them together. So whether that's people, places, brands, institutions, projects, the studio itself and the creatives within it, collaboration is really the non-negotiable. And when we're kind of collaborating, there is this notion which I think is connected to the state of play, which is really, really critical now. We live in a world with no middle. And the projects that are working really sit right on the edges of everything, on the extremities. And that's because the proliferation of collaborations and projects has reached absolute mass saturation. So the visionary audiences that are kind of connecting with them, they are really pushing to the edges, the extremities of that process and that project in order to find that truth. So if there are kind of initiatives or projects or kind of opportunities that sit in the middle, they are becoming more and more irrelevant in this kind of cluttered world we live in. So a little bit of how this kind of works, the world of no middle as a concept, is the projects and the entities and the kind of the brands kind of initiatives that are working really exist on the edges. So pure exploration, which is a kind of a really innovative definition of collaboration, this idea of 1 + 1 = 3, which we'll come on to later. This is really about exploration and pushing into new space. This develops emotional response and discussion in various audiences, and this one is about to kind of, the impact is to try and future-proof the entity, but also to kind of go into new space, a laboratory per se, that can give information back about what the future looks like. On the other end of the spectrum, there is a very tactical and utility-driven definition of collaborations, one for one, which is I need to develop this, I need to create this, I need to achieve this, I can't do it on my own. What is the party I need to work with in order to deliver that? They are very different, but they have equal validity. But when various agendas come in, the purity of collaboration is lost. And the middle, I call it, is the swamp of mediocrity. You see things that are based on kind of low-level agendas or financial objectives or things that kind of almost decay the terminology, and this is where actually a lot of projects are right now. But it's not all doom and gloom, because actually the quantity and the size of the swamp means that actually the projects with integrity, with beauty and with purpose really punch through. Right, a little bit of a pause there. There's a lot to say, and I can definitely get lost in the sauce and speak about this forever. But essentially, why are we here? So I think we want to talk about the sectors, sport, fashion and wellness, some case studies around some entities and projects in the past and the present that have formed the world that we live in, and the behaviours that connected to it, which is performance, style and care. They're intrinsically connected to those sectors. So, just the word. I mean, we talked about it a little bit, but the definition of this word has been eroded, commoditized, and in some ways decimated over the last decade plus. The reality of the scenario is that it exists as a verb as well, and the idea of working with people, helping people to achieve things that are bigger than the sum of its parts is the purest and most dear definition of the word. And collaboration can exist with a little c and a big C. And the big C, which is the part that has been most commoditized, has been a very effective lever for many corporations, many fashion brands, many wellness brands, and in some ways is a victim of its own success. There are so many incredible projects in the past that have achieved huge things, have changed the state of play in various sectors, but because of that success, there are many others that are kind of focusing on impact without purpose. And again, we connect that to this swamp of mediocrity we talked about before. So what are real collaborations? I think real collaborations are built around this notion of value systems. So when things are not rushed, relationships are not rushed, a combined set of values, a system can be formed between entities, and the exploration can be based on something pure and something based on the integrity and the makeup and the DNA of both parties. And once that value system is formed, it can go into various different places. So when that value system is formed, this idea of 1 + 1 = 3 is a really, really interesting kind of formula where that value system can breed results which are bigger than the sum of its parts. And if we look at these three sectors, their kind of obsession with intersections is kind of well thought out, because essentially the energy that these collaborations give will always be bigger than the sum of its parts. And if you think about why that's the case, the body is always at the center of that. It's not only, it's the muse, but it's also the critical part for these sectors existing. It is the center point for all these three kind of sectors. But if those entities have true collaboration, their reliance and their kind of interdependency on others can really push culture forward. So in a fractured world that we live in, we talked about this. I think everyone is trying to find that truth. And right now, what does that truth mean for audiences? It's about being supported and inspired in equal measure. And I think if you look at sport, wellness and fashion, that is kind of their obligation in this world, is to help drive identity, to help care for your body, to help push the human condition into new spaces. And the intersection of those allows them to move forward in a more meaningful way. And the collaboration and connection between those sectors allows people to live, move, and recover in a way that potentially they couldn't on their own. So, I'm going to give you some case studies of some projects that I've worked in the past, some brands that I've worked with, some friends. And I feel like these are projects and entities that are kind of living authentically in these intersections. So, firstly, Martine Rose. She's one of the most wonderful human beings you're ever likely to meet, a truly incredible person. When we talk about lived experience, I don't think I've ever met anyone that is more honest to this. I mean, she's well celebrated as one of the most incredible fashion designers in the world, but I think the most important thing about her is that she has lived and breathed subculture since a very, very early age. And central to her practice is about almost the representation of her own life experiences in various fields, rave culture, in queer communities, in various kind of cultural fields, and taking her own experiences and representing them, and her medium to do so is clothing and products. So when we met up probably 7 to 8 years ago, we started talking about football as a phenomenon. And at that point, not so much now, she was really not hugely interested in the actual game, but she was fascinated about the emotion, the psychology, and the community around fandom. And I think whether you're interested in football or not, you can see the emotion and the passion and the kind of cultural kind of impact of it is omnipresent. And in her early work, she often used the archetype of the football shirt as a means to almost subvert the codes of, at that point, a very kind of masculine sport. And she did it with great effect within our own collections. And then when she started speaking to me when I was at Nike still about this phenomenon, we started talking about how the game unites people, how it is a canvas for various different kind of design languages, etc. And we thought, how could we go on a journey which starts pushing the sport and the definition of that sport from a Nike perspective into new space? And working with a fashion label like Martine's, you're automatically going to build a value system, and the output of it is going to push into spaces that either party couldn't reach on their own. And if you look at vertical definitions of football, or the audiences who are interested around major tournaments, without Martine's lens, I think that there were a variety of communities around the world that probably wouldn't have been that interested in the vertical definition of football. So we were really interested in that. We were also interested in kind of the very outer edges of the football fan. And that, again, as we discussed before, that started this kind of very careful examination and exploration of what we could do together. I think one of the things that I feel hugely grateful for is that Nike gave us a long period to make this work. They knew at the time that it was a very visionary and revolutionary kind of idea, and it needed absolute freedom, and it also needed time. So there's three kind of major parts in this journey that I'll call out, but there's lots really to talk about. And it always, with any relationship, it's about starting in a space where you can kind of explore together. So before anyone really saw anything about this collaboration, there was prototype shirts that you saw on the runway, with no press messaging, with no kind of explanation of why they were there, and they were all developing how authentically an international sportswear brand could interact with a very beautiful independent team and label. And instead of walking directly into that relationship, it was about testing it, and with each test it was about learning, and that resulted into an opportunity that came up with the England team. And Martine and actually her team, there's a lady called Shawnee who actually used to play women's football at a very high level, came to us with an incredible story about a team called the Lost Lionesses, and essentially they were a pioneering group of women in the, test me now, early 60s that really championed women's football and laid down the kind of the foundation for what it is now. And I believe that without these women, I wouldn't say that you would go to an Arsenal game and see the stadium full of incredible fans like you do now. But for various reasons, they didn't really get the plaudits that they deserved, and a lot of their achievements were unrecognised. So Martine and the team had a hugely beautiful bit of research, and they wanted to kind of tell this story to the world. So together with the England team and the FA, it was a very brave project on all behalves. We managed to kind of launch the story during a men's tournament to almost showcase that there is the other side of the story. So we manufactured this special shirt. I actually should have brought a sample of it, but essentially that it is reversible, and essentially the inside was designed as to hold the story of the Lost Lionesses and these incredible women, and it showed that when you wear it inside out, this hidden story that was kind of forgotten for so many years could actually take centre stage. So the way that Martine's wearing it in that photo is the kind of essentially the England side, but when it's reversed, the original crest that the women from this World Cup had on their chest is revealed. So I think it started off a very, I suppose, quite political project actually, but it set the tone of whatever we have to do. It has to be provocative, it has to push the edges, and it has to call questions on the status quo. So that really set the tone of how we were going to do things. And essentially it was only on a football shirt at that stage, but that was like the first stage. And after that, the phenomenon of the Shocks MR4 came to fruition. This one was developed for pretty much most of COVID actually. So this is a picture of a wonderful footwear designer at Nike called Gerald, who is probably one of the most inspirational designers that I've worked with in the footwear space. He really is a genius. And Martine and the team set him a pretty difficult task, which was she wanted to take the codes of football and take the codes of formal wear, completely deconstruct the Nike Shocks R4, and then rebuild it with completely different kind of codes in mind. So it had an elongated heel, it had the heel removed into a mule shape, and the insight at the time was she wanted female footballers to feel like superstars. And there was a lot of research about power dressing and power suits in the 80s and what it felt like to put that armour on. So we started a multi-year project. The first year the shoe came out because it was kind of the first iteration, and then we had a second version, a second launch, which was around the Women's World Cup, and we wanted to be very literal with that intention, and actually clothe really, really incredible women at the top of their game. And she met Megan Rapinoe through that process and was hugely inspired by a lot of the work that she did. I think she once protested against equal pay in the US Federation, and she wore the shirt inside out, which is one of the inspiration points for the original England shirt. And she became somewhat of a muse for that project. And we realised a dream, which was something that it was a beautiful kind of culmination of this journey. And through an Italian, made in Italy collection, very expensive, very exclusive, we built probably the most sartorial items of clothing Nike's ever made in history. And they had specific versions, and they walked out in front of the press to play probably the biggest tournament of their lives. Megan actually is probably one of the last World Cup she played, I believe. But it was an incredible moment. And the end of that, really, just to kind of wrap it up, is going into this idea of intersections, which is a fashion brand and a sports brand. They could not have achieved any of these outputs alone. And spending time on the value system and building that value system in its early phases meant that the project, and it's still going on now, this notion of kind of the intersections of sport and fashion has created a multi-year journey. And there's so many different sports and so many different kind of communities that this methodology to connect, and I'm very excited to see what is coming next from both entities. Also, just on a commercial level, I think it's important to say that being brave at that point and pushing into new space created a whole new aesthetic. And if you look now, the assortment of Nike footwear in the female space has a huge component of shocks, and a small, very left field and very kind of like wild project that Nike invested in has, in the long term, slowly created a huge commercial franchise for the business. And the bravery shown at that point with integrity means that often you're rewarded. Okay, and I want to talk to you about another Nike project which is very, very different, which is back in 2019. My team in London worked with Virgil Abloh on a project called Track and Field, and one of the many, many things that Virgil was incredible about was this idea of taking the codes and the design language of certain entities and completely kind of reframing them. And in this part, he had actually done a fashion show in Paris about 7-8 months before this experience that we created, which took the codes of the running track and the athletes. I think Dina Asher-Smith was one that walked the catwalk, to reframe the definition of sport. You know, this idea that athletes had to be the fastest, the best specimens of a human being, and they were pushing the limits is something that Nike can do on its own. But with the team in Portland, he came up with this notion of an athlete in progress. And how could we take the codes of sport and investigate into notions of play? How do we bring the fun back to certain elements, and how do we bring people together? Again, this idea of human connection was like really important. So what did we do? We worked actually with a couple of really incredible creative directors at another studio called Convoy. Actually, I've just brought Love magazine back to the world. And it was a wonderful kind of experience working with Virgil's team and with Convoy to really kind of try and crack this solution. And on the top left, you can see it was inspired by many things in the past. There's a bit of Takeshi's Castle probably in there. There's a few different kind of views of games that you would see kids playing. And they wanted, at the time, to review the key Olympic sports and change the definition of what they are, to kind of live against this idea of play. and this idea of community and this idea of identity. So this idea that anyone could be a part of it needed to be displayed. Obviously, it was, you know, an event only for the few, but this idea that everyone should be represented was really important to the team at the time. So there was a variety of different teams, and they were all connected to kind of every borough in London. And really, it was a mix of some of the most incredible kind of emerging creatives from the city at the time. I think in that picture you can see Sloan and Mowalola, but there was a variety of different incredible people from various fields that attended. And from his studio, he built everything, and this really was like an incredible moment for the city. And not only was it a beautiful design, but it was done in the international facility in Edmonton, where England's sprinters and Team GB sprinters and athletes actually train. So that kind of intersection between a design concept coming from a fashion place and pushing it into the most authentic venue for athletics in this country really kind of asked a lot of questions of the definitions of sport. And the product that he designed around it was driven in the same way. And he was taking kind of low profile running shoes, track spikes from Nike, and actually designing them to be used in a non-performance way via this kind of notion of play. So it was a pretty beautiful project. The next case study I want to talk a little bit about is some friends that I currently work very closely with, who are the founders of Our Legacy. Workshop is probably a platform that you know quite well. It's a circular platform that investigates various different materials and residual fabrics, and it works with incredible brands to look almost into their cupboard of what they have left over and reconstitute beautiful items that you would never even think are made from waste. Their new project that we worked on together is their sport pillar. Really interesting kind of view from them is they really wanted to remove like the verticals in the definition of sport and really put culture and style into the fore. So their kind of sport practice really is about creating garments that can be worn all day and that translate very seamlessly across different sports. So it's a very different view to what vertical fashion brands have. Their belief is that the community, and these are all friends of theirs, around the world, whatever sport they're playing, they don't need to kind of change into things. There is something which takes the aesthetics and the design lines of Our Legacy. As a main brand, I think that they have a beautiful view on creating garments. Their kind of one-liner, which I love, is they exist in the middle of familiarity and counterculture, which I think is beautiful. For them, sport and life is fluid, and the notion of performance is really like the act of living. And these people are just friends of theirs that sport is just a part of their lives, and they're creatives, they are artists, musicians, and sport is something which they need for their own mental health and for something for enjoyment, and they don't really see the difference between their creative practices and their need to do this. And the products are all designed around that, and they're hugely successful. It's only one collection that's come out in 2 parts, and it's been very successful, and it really kind of like captures really what a lot of people are kind of living and breathing. And again, it's this kind of intersection which is built from a value system, which is very important. So next I want to talk about Tekla Fabrics. They're an incredible company based out of Copenhagen. Centre to the practice is this idea of new universes in the home. One of the co-founders was from fashion, but he really wanted to do something very, very different. So he's taken the codes from there, and that really informs what I would say that they call us like products that really care for you. And this notion of care is something which is like critical to the definition of the segment of wellness. And the kind of the main philosophy behind these projects is to help the wearer and the user kind of have a more thoughtful way of life. And they often collaborate. And here's two examples. They work with Stussy and also Orally in Japan. But for them, it's really about this idea of world building in wellness, and why they collaborate with these entities. There's sections of them which really connect to the universes of which Tekla are very, very kind of connected to. So Stussy, since its origination, has been something which has been really connected to kind of the outdoors through kind of beach, snowboarding, outdoor, and I think Tekla's view is that they really wanted to take the home outside, and the intersection between kind of this like freedom and beauty and wellness that you experience on the outside. They love the idea of combining that kind of spirit and taking that kind of beauty into the home. So there was these vibrant and beautiful images about bedwear and bedding and pajamas and products from in the home being shot outside. And at the time, that was kind of pretty much one of the first times that a brand connected to street culture had really like invested in the home. And then on the other end of the spectrum, they work with Orally, I think, and there was a huge cultural kind of nuance and like the notion of bathing in Scandinavia. Bathing and sauna is very critical to the mental health and the behaviour of people in various Scandinavian countries, and in Japan they have a very different kind of view on it, but the philosophy and the need for it in people's lives is the same, and the kind of examination of the nuances and the differences between both cultures brought this beautiful collection which was centred on the connection between onsen, sauna, etc., and it came together in a really beautiful way, and the imagery and the communication around it, you really feel that kind of through line between two cultures that really value bathing and self-care, but have very different kind of viewpoints on it, and the connection between them came together in a really beautiful way. So I want to talk to you about a new entity and a new brand from LA who I became very good friends with, who are doing incredible work. They're very emerging, but I think they're incredible. Is a brand called OEM. If you don't know them, definitely check them out. There's a couple, one from Canada, one from Japan, and they kind of born this incredible idea of a company based on an experience of walking into CVS in the US and having just a very cold experience about how to buy products that are helping us survive in this crazy world. So this idea of they wanted, Shun, who's one of the founders, grew up going to onsens, etc., and he really wanted an experience longer term to be a bit more in that zone where you feel a feeling of calm and you feel there's a beautiful environment where you're trying to have prescriptions or items that are going to help your body. Why does it have to feel so cold, and why does it have to feel so medicinal? It can be better. And for them, they're hugely ambitious, but they also believe hugely in the power of the concept. So they already create incredible products to help various things. The human body, so various parts of the body, like the strain that they go through on the everyday, how can they create products that help us traverse life much better? And they're just starting out, but they have an incredible design language. They have they're building worlds with every single thing they're doing. They've got a variety of new products coming, but what struck me from early is their huge ambition. And when they talked about this environment of like what they want to do, longer term, they want to create environments like this one that viscerally make you feel. They're not in the zone where they can do that right now, but they're quite happy to open source their vision to the world. So if you want to go and check them out on Arena, there's a load of like really interesting reference images there. And instead of dreaming big and holding these images hidden, they're just showing the world, like, this is what we want to do. We had this huge conversation about what if they could build a running track. Again, is something which I talked about being such a clinical thing. Why couldn't it be a lot more beautiful? Why couldn't it connect with like codes of nature? So they concepted this idea of this kind of irregular, beautiful, kind of like welcoming running track that connected through nature, that connects into various many things. And they're working on some brilliant projects now, but the idea, which I love, is like they are taking intersections from the design world, because they come from the design world, and instead of holding them in, they're showing the world, this is what it could be like. And I love this idea of the power of the concept. They create incredible publications and white papers on things that they feel the world needs, and I feel that they're gonna exponentially grow hugely in the next few years, because again, they connect a lot with the behaviours that we talked about, what people need, and themselves as the ethos of their brand, as they are helping people find their own truths as well, which I think is hugely powerful. So what does it all mean? Well, you guys have to find that out just the same as me, but some little things that I think we can kind of like extrapolate from a lot of those case studies and a lot of those theories is the edges are incredibly important. So beauty often lives at these edges, and when sport, fashion and wellness collaborate with integrity and with value systems like we spoke about, they can unlock new cultural spaces and answer real human needs. So when, again, we always go back to that idea of value system. Once that value system is really formed and is really kind of based on integrity and beauty, then actually you can insert problems or opportunities that real humans have every day, and together they can come up with incredible solutions. And the output of it, what will the future be? Well, the body, as the muse of all of these, and the integral like definition of them, will always be the final judge. So if these explorations, these projects, they help people find truth and live better, I truly believe that the energy they create will define the evolution of these three sectors. And if you go back to some of the examples, the bravery to do maybe some quite outlandish projects, not all of them will bring that kind of energy back and that solution back, but every now and again it will. And the ability for these organizations and entities to continually be trying and commissioning and pushing into new space and bravely exploring, I believe is essentially how these sectors will evolve and how they will enable and support communities and audiences around the world to live better, essentially. So there we go. Thank you very much for your time. And if there's any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer.
Does anyone have any questions?
Maybe in terms of collaboration, how does that conversation start, like between, for example, Martine and Nike, or then like Tekla and Stussy and so on? Is it like just one brand reaching out, or is it just something organic that grows?
It's a good question. The answer is there isn't one answer, there's many, but I can tell you that the size of the organisation plays a big role in it, so I think we should probably separate both of those examples. From a Nike perspective, the teams that I used to run all go back to that first slide, which is the most important people in those teams were the kind of freshest, the youngest people who had just joined, because they were the closest person to the audience that we were talking to. And I always used to say when they joined, is like, don't forget what it's like before you joined, because that's I'm mainly interested in that psychology and try and remain that as long as possible, because the first phase is not rushing this, is essentially mapping different communities and different subcultures. Brands have no real right, they don't create culture, but they are there to provide the tools for people that do. And in order to do that, there has to be an honest and a conversation with integrity. So these kind of people that exist authentically in subcultures and the arts and design in cities all around the world are constantly mapping and meeting and looking for those authentic relationships. And out of those relationships become areas to test, and out of those testing there's that value system builds, and then projects come. Now that is one definition. The reality is that we live in a very different world now where brands need dopamine hits to solve solutions. So there's obviously big collaborations between respected entities that happen, and you have to fast forward that process. But with Martin and Samuel Ross as two examples from Nike from that team, they started off very, very organically. You know, Martin's first project with Nike was us just helping her put a show on and doing prototype shirts. I think Samuel Ross, the first thing he did, he made some packaging for a Stone Island project back then. It wasn't really about the product. We didn't need him to do that, but it was just a way of testing the relationship and using a project in order to cultivate that value system. And on the Tekla piece, the creative director is really, really an incredible human being. He knows exactly what he wants to do, and he knows exactly what that value system is about, kind of care. He sees beauty in a very specific way, and the relationship with it is because he has a relationship with them and they saw beauty in a very similar way to him. So you can kind of almost like fast forward the process a little bit based on kind of like the length of the product and the intention. So there's not one answer, but the only answer that is like omnipresent, again, it goes back to the idea of value system. When you have that, you can create beautiful things, and you can go on journeys with people because it's based on something. And I think a lot of the time that does go down to relationships with people, with teams, etc. When you have that, and you have that solid ground, that kind of bedrock to build on, you're going to create something truthful and meaningful and amazing. And if you don't, that's when other agendas and other things go in, and those are, you know, that's kind of the swamp of mediocrity that we talked about. But great question.
Can I just, off the back of that, I was just curious, because I guess what you're indicating there is like those collaborations are formed through relationships between people, and that builds in whatever way. I guess like one could assume that these kind of collaborations are much more kind of strategic, like someone in somewhere in, say, like Nike go, we need to work with this type of person, and then, you know, like just make it happen kind of thing. But in your experiences, are those collaborations actually much more organic and much more kind of relationally formed?
I would say you always wear two masks in these conversations, which is various people at that time, you still have got to realise that you work for a corporation, and it is there. Yes, it's there from innovation, from sport point of view, but it is a corporation. It's there to make money. You know, that is what it is. And I suppose often in these relationships, you never feel the pressure at all. That doesn't come into the conversation. But when you zoom out, you realise that you are an employee of a corporation. So almost like subconsciously and consciously, you do realise that the strategy of the brand, the fields within sport, innovation, culture, etc., they're embedded into your kind of psyche when you enter these projects. So there's that part of it, but also you do know priorities that are coming up, you know, football being one in that example. And in reality, going back to edges, these teams are right at the edge of the brand, and a lot of the time, you know, you do have real relationships with these people, you know, and you want success, but also you know that there's an obligation of brands to help businesses and these entities survive like a crazy world. So you have a variety of different kind of tools and levers that you can pull, but the best projects come by balancing them all. The relationship and allowing freedom, but you also need to know what tools you've got. So if you know that for the next 5 years, in that example, that football is always going to be a main priority for Nike, and part of that is to kind of look how it can spread into new audiences, the women's game being one of them, you know, like, okay, I'm going to have tools for the next few years. So when you're building that value system, you also need tools to do things. So if you build something really beautiful that's not connected to any priorities, you're going to find later down the line you don't really have the tools to give to these kind of entities and these design teams to do things with. So like many things, that set of values needs to be based on beauty and kind of strategic part, but it needs to have a pragmatism to it, which is like, okay, how are we going to build it? And then those tools come from where the resources are in these brands.
Speaking about edges, because you grew up in a subculture, I guess in the last like decade or two, subcultures have become like really fragmented.
Yes.
Maybe like vanished. Did you notice any change in the way that like brands approach certain audiences that might be more niche and smaller?
Very good question. And I think the first part of it you've nailed is that, where do I start? Could we speak like this for a while? But I think the proliferation of information and content, social media and various other things, have meant that the knowledge that people have at the early age is like unbelievably huge. So the reality of, I mean, I'm 40 years old, so I was born in 1985. My sister's generation, and she's 10 years older than me, is if you're a kid living in Blackburn or, you know, in a more rural city per se, and you get a copy of The Face magazine, you would open it up and it was a beacon to a whole world that you'd never even known. So ultimately you had, I would say, probably like more like tribal subcultures where I'm into this is who I am, this is my crew, and I don't need to look left or right because I feel at home here. And as you said, those subcultures last a lot longer because, you know, they weren't probably kind of burnt out as quick, because if you went, you know, I think that video that played of an underground resistance kind of rave in like 1992, they were, you know, it's rare to have that footage. You know, that was not captured. So a lot of those kind of that kind of joy and that kind of sense of identity was like kind of protected for a lot longer period of time. But as you rightly say, now I don't think the subcultures have, I would say, I don't think they don't exist anymore, but they are born, they kind of exist and they destroy themselves at a rate which is far quicker than we've ever seen before. And because of that, and connected to the way that, you know, brands are, that kind of model of watching, giving tools and letting those tools be adopted themselves probably isn't possible anymore. I mean, if we go talk about it from a Nike point of view, look at in 1995 someone won the marathon wearing a pair of Air Max 95s, and you know, you fast forward decades later and it becomes like a shoe of street culture in various different kind of communities. They had no role in that. That was adopted and kind of found by the community itself. But now, because of the pace of everything, I think it's difficult for brands almost to have how to interact with them because they don't have the time. You know, they don't have the time to kind of be authentic, have those relationships, give the tools, etc. So they have to find new ways, you know. And my belief on that is giving up control to gain it. You know, really, if they know the timeline is exponentially faster, is to just create tools and just leave them. leave them in the hands of those important communities and let them kind of define the future of themselves. The problem comes when they want to give the tools and define the outcome, because then it's over. So it is a difficult one, and there isn't a right answer, but I think the reality is about bravery and letting communities and audiences and subcultures define the output themselves.
We're due to time, we're going to end, but I guess the last question I have was, which I'm asking all of the speakers, was obviously the theme of the summit is around kind of fashion and kind of optimization, and this kind of term optimization. And the question is what are we being kind of optimized for? And so, yeah, what does kind of optimization mean for you? And yeah, what are we being optimized for?
I mean, it's really hard to give one example of that. It depends, I would say, what side of the fence you're on. I think from a brand side, and we've said this before, is like everything's becoming so commoditized, you know? So a dystopian view, we're not being optimized, we're being commoditized, you know, into these, I suppose, like cells that businesses can kind of feed off, you know? And that is the same, is unless you're completely unconnected to the world, brands and entities know more about you than ever before, and they can tailor products not only that adhere to the behaviour, they can augment it and create the behaviour that they want as well, which is, you know, where it's going. So again, this is the idea of like living at the edges. There is going to be a significant movement of people that are being optimised to be and live in a way that corporations want them to, so they can feed products. And on the other side, there's going to be the reaction to that, where people are going to, you know, optimize their own behaviors to break away from that. And I think that optimization is going to kind of, again, go to the side of the world with no middle. You're going to see only the extremities. And it's, you know, this idea of, why do you think the rise of analog is happening? You know, magazines, vinyl, various kind of offline kind of objects are increasing in popularity daily, because people want something that is offline, where have a little bit more tactility and trust in things not being kind of like hyper optimized for them. So I just think, yeah, the seas will somewhat part.
Great, thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you.